Welcome to this week's edition of History Now. I'm joined by Professor Sean O'Connell and Dr Leanne McCormick, who are going to tell us about a very important oral history project, and they're going to put an appeal out to people to get involved. So if we can go to you, Sean, first. Can you tell us about this project? I know it's between Queen's and UU. Can you just give us a bit of info on the background of it and how it came about?
Certainly, it's a project that's funded by the Department of Health, who've asked us to look at the history of mother and baby homes, but also Magdalene Laundries. That's the kind of Good Sheppard convent laundries, and also there was a laundry at Thorndale, which was run by the Salvation Army. So we've been asked to look at them for the Department of Health and write a report for the Department of Health, and they're going to then consider if there should be a public inquiry following on from the kind of pathway that's been taken in the Republic of Ireland. I'm sure a lot of your viewers have been following that and following the events down there. There's been a lot of pressure on the Northern Ireland Executive before it was dissolved, pressure from groups like Birth Mothers for Justice and from Savia, and also from Amnesty International and United Nations, who've asked the Northern Ireland Executive really to take a serious look at how mother and baby homes operated here and how the laundries operated here. Obviously there's been lots of quite serious allegations about some of the things that might have gone on in the past, and that's what we've been asked to look at. So
yeah, it's a extremely important piece of research, and it's quite different from, for want of a better term, normal historical research. What type of problems does that pose for yourselves in terms of time frames and in terms of you really have to get it right?
It's a very interesting question because normally historians and academics in general have the opportunity to have a long-term plan, a long-term approach to how they operate their research, and they design their own timetables. In this case, that really hasn't been necessarily the case because we've been given a series of questions and a series of limitations really upon the way that we answer and approach some of those questions that isn't normally the case. I suppose we're also dealing with a lot of different groups who have very different expectations about what we might achieve and hopes and desires maybe for what we might achieve, whether that's victims and survivors groups, the Department of Health, the media and journalists have their own interests and their own agendas as well. So it's been a very challenging project and continues to be a challenging project, but one thing that we're both learning a lot from and we're finding very stimulating. I'm sure Leanne probably agrees with that.
Given there are these extra pressures, did you anticipate that before you took it up, and did it really affect wanting to be involved in it? I can go to you, Leanne.
Yes, I think it was something that we were both very keen to do. For me personally, the history of Magdalene Laundries, mother and baby homes, and those sort of institutions that women would have entered in the past as well is something that I've worked on for a long time. It was the focus of my PhD. So this was something that I was very keen to be able to look at in the context of right up until the end of the 20th century. Given the various inquiries and research that had taken place in the Republic as well, it felt very important that we were able to look at Northern Ireland and what happened, and also that we were able to take an approach that looked at both oral history and heard the testimonies and the experiences of women and people who'd been involved in the institutions, and also was able to look at the archival material as well.
If either of you want to come in on this, or both, so oral history is a big part of this. Without getting into too much detail, I'm sure it's confidential, about what has been done so far and what is still to be done. If we can go to you first, Sean.
We've probably interviewed around about 50 people now. So they come from a variety of backgrounds and have been able to provide us with testimony about a variety of issues. Lots of them have told us about mother and baby homes. We've had a lot of individuals who've come and been from particular occupational or clerical backgrounds. I've just heard today, for example, we're going to secure interviews with a few ex-probation officers, retired probation officers. retired social workers. So a range of individuals that allow us to piece a jigsaw together from their testimony. The one area where we feel we're slightly lacking, and that's one of the reasons why we wanted to speak to you today, is to talk about women who'd been in the Good Sheppard convents and had been in the laundry there. That's either in Waterside in Derry, or in Newry, or in the Ulster Road, Belfast. We've got a small number of testimonies that provide us with some insights into their experiences, but we'd really like to hear some more so that we can really pad out our knowledge of that and really have a much greater sense of the kind of conditions that were operated in those establishments, how the working arrangements were organised, why women ended up there, and how they feel about their experience of being there. So it's either the women themselves, or it might be their children or other relatives who could tell us about that, or it might be individuals who had experience of going to carry out some work there, maybe a plumber or an electrician, or the man who delivered the laundry to either any of those three establishments at various points in time. So there's a lot of people out there who have stories, who have testimony, and maybe they don't think it's important, but even just small bits of information can enable us to build up a big picture and answer some of the quite serious questions that we've been asked to answer by the Department of Health.
Leanne, if I can go to you, you just mentioned that your PhD was on that. What time frame did you look at, and was your approach to that, was there oral history involved in that, and what are the similarities between your previous research on this project?
My previous research really looked at the very early part, the first half of the 20th century. So went back into the 19th century, into the establishment of a lot of these institutions, and then really only sort of followed through to about the middle of the 20th century. One of the things that I, and along with sort of other historians who've worked on it, was the fact that we weren't able to access archives relating to these institutions, and I suppose that's been one of the big differences with the work that we're doing now, is the fact that we are able to access and to look at the archives relating to a number of those institutions that remained through the second half of the 20th century. Many of the institutions that I looked at had closed by the first couple of decades of the 20th century, and that was the pattern for particularly a lot of the Protestant lay establishments which had been formed in the early part of the mid part of the 19th century. They'd largely closed by then, so that there are a few that survive. But so the big difference is, I suppose, the access that we do now have to those archival records.
And if we can just bring in, the history of these institutions, they go by a lot of names, and there are a lot of different ones. Can you just give us a sense of what they were and what their function was, and perhaps the differences between them in terms of what their function was and what parts of the community they not served but were over?
I suppose one of the preconceived ideas that people have about these institutions when they hear the word Magdalene Laundry is that these are Catholic-run institutions, that they're run by religious orders. And while that's true for some, there were a large number of Protestant lay-run asylums as well. So the first, actually in Ireland, the first asylum is established in Dublin in 1767 by Lady Arabella Denny. But you see a growth of these establishments really from the middle of the 19th century, both Protestant and Catholic. So in Belfast, for example, by the first decade of the 20th century, there is the Good Sheppard convent, and the Good Sheppards took over an asylum for penitent women from the Sisters of Mercy, and then by the end of the 19th century had moved to where there's still the building at the end of the Ormeau Road. You had a Presbyterian-run Ulster Female Penitentiary that was established in 1819. It has moves about a bit in the 19th century before again having a new building at the end of the Ormeau Road, and it becomes known as the Edgar Home by then. There is Church of Ireland, Ulster Magdalene Asylum, which was in Donegal Pass. There was Belfast Midnight Mission, which was in Malone Place, just where sort of Shaftesbury Square, and it's still run by the NHS today. And also then the Salvation Army came to Belfast in 1905 as well. So there were a plethora of institutions for women. Of course, there's no corresponding institution for men, but a large number for women. And they were initially set up with the idea for setting them up was about reforming prostitutes. This was the sort of their main agenda, that they would. Organisations like the Midnight Mission did exactly what they sort of said. They would go out at night onto the streets, look for women that either were sex workers or who they thought might be in danger, bring them back to the mission, give them a cup of tea and try and persuade them to enter one of the rescue and refuge homes. But really, by the end of the 19th century, there weren't very many prostitutes in these homes, and if they were women who may have only just, been on the streets for a very short period of time, largely because a lot of these institutions, particularly the Protestant-run institutions, had sort of preferred to take women who were relatively young. They wanted to be able to offer some kind of reform. They would like you to stay for 2 years and maybe train you in laundry work or get you back into domestic service. So the idea of taking women who would be called hardened prostitutes was something that these were people who weren't going to be reformed. So they very rarely took those type of people in. The big difference between Catholic and Protestant institutions was often in size. So the Good Sheppard convent, for example, would have been much bigger in size than some of the Protestant-run institutions which operated on a smaller basis. And again, women may have stayed, while a lot of the Protestant institutions had a sort of 2 year was the ideal period that they thought for reform. Catholic institutions, there wasn't that same time period. Women were encouraged often to stay for longer periods.
When did the majority of these start to, fold or fade out of view?
So you see, again, thinking about Belfast as an example, that the Ulster Magdalene Asylum closes in 1916. It just isn't financially viable. The Edgar Home closes by 1928. And the two main sort of institutions that stay operating in those particular forms are the Good Shepherd sisters, and also Thorndale, which is the Salvation Army home. They had moved from South Belfast to Thorndale, just off the Antrim Road, in the 1920s, and they operate what's often referred to as an industrial home. The idea that they were taking in women for all sorts of different reasons, but for various periods of time could stay in that home. So for the time period that we're looking at, from 1922 onwards, those are the Good Shepherd sisters in Belfast, Newry and Derry, and also Thorndale in Belfast. The Salvation Army are the institutions that are come under that umbrella really of Magdalene Laundries, as we refer to them now.
Sean, can you give us a sense of what women would have had to have, what their circumstances were in order for them to be in these type of institutions?
Well, there's quite a variety of reasons why women may have ended up in one of these institutions. I mean, a fairly straightforward movement might be from a mother and baby home, which were often linked to these institutions. So they might have the baby and then be moved into one of these institutions, one of the laundries, for a period of time. They may have been placed there on remand. They may have been placed there as part of their probation. So in order to avoid being sent to prison or for some other terms associated with probation, they may have been placed in one of these institutions, so for a specific amount of time. In other cases, perhaps through some arrangement via the family and possibly also members of the clergy, they could have been placed there. Other women may have been placed there because there were possibly for reasons around mental health or disability, or the current term would be as special needs, a situation involving special needs, where there might have been some arrangement with a family and a placement for them there. And some of this relates to a lack of other facilities potentially that were on offer from the state. But that's something we want to investigate, to what extent there weren't other facilities for individuals in that kind of group, and whether this was the only option, whether this was the best option for them. So, you know, how it came about that they were in this place. And some of those women were unfortunate and may have been there for quite a long time. Others who were on remand or on probation were there for much shorter periods of time. So it's possibly some of the women who were there for shorter periods of time who may watch this, or their families may watch this, and who may want to come forward and talk to us about what they observed when they were there and how they feel the system operated.
Yeah. So just what you've said there about people who are probably categorised as special needs, that's a very important part in terms of what other facilities were there. But in other things, what you've said there, was it the case that these institutions were a substitute for prison? An alternative for prison, because you're talking about probations and stuff.
Yes, I mean, that's essentially what they were, and I mean that had been the case. I think, you know this better than I would, but I mean that had been the case prior to the formation of the Northern Irish State. I mean, it goes back to legislation from the late 19th and early 20th century. Yeah,
and it's fairly common, and a lot of the institutions would have had somebody who would have a sort of court visitor who would have gone and sat in the court and have said, particularly for young women, let them come to us. This would be a much better alternative than sending them to prison and letting them mix with those hardened criminals. But we would see through, so for example, the prison registers will sometimes say the person is sort of admitted to prison, but actually they've been sent to the Good Sheppard or Thorndale for a year as an alternative to prison. So right through the period, these are used as an alternative to prison.
So because they were used as alternative to prison as well, is there this sort of stigma attached to them that you were in a kind of prison, and what sort of problems does that pose for someone who's trying to get people to talk about that type of experience?
It causes a lot of problems because, as you say, that the stigma is there. There's a society placed shame on these individual women, and these women should feel no shame, but society placed shame on them. It may be that in many cases they haven't revealed this aspect of their past to their families or to extended members of their families and friends. So clearly that's a difficulty for them. It's a difficulty for them to deal with that. It was a traumatic experience for them as well, and speaking about this is a traumatic experience. I mean, what we can say is when they come to us, they'll come in and be treated in complete anonymity. We will respect their anonymity in the report that we write or anything else that's written around this. No one's identity will be revealed. We have a brilliant young old historian called Oliver D who conducts these interviews, and she's extremely sympathetic, and I know from listening to the interviews that they are traumatic, a lot of them. There's tears, but that the women at the end of it there's a sense of finally somebody has listened to my story, finally somebody has taken my story seriously and wants to hear about my experience and to go back to the state, and if people have got a complaint, then they make that complaint to Olivia, and it's on the tape and it's on the record, and we'll ensure that the state hears their complaint.
So Leanne, if we can go back to you just on the actual history of the places. Now, some of these places closed relatively recently. Can you tell us about that?
While both Thorndale still exists and the Salvation Army are still on the site, their work has changed and has adapted and is much more focused on families and working with families there as well. The Good Sheppard in Belfast was the last of the Newry and Derry institutions to close, and the building is actually up for sale. The main convent building is up for sale at the minute. There are still in a care home beside it, and in another sort of aspect of sheltered housing living in the site are women who had been in the Good Sheppard home, and nuns who'd also Good Sheppard nuns. So they are still sort of living in the site. So in terms of that, I suppose the history and the experience is still there and still very, very real too, and still continues on that site anyway as well.
When we're working in history, we think, we're working generations past, but it's still, very...
Yeah, it's a very real experience. And also for the fact that these institutions, did operate, through to the 80s and 90s. We are talking about, lots of women out there who are not, sometimes this idea that these are, it's very elderly women we're talking about. We're not. We're talking about women who are still relatively young, who may have had experience of being in those institutions, and for a lot of those women as well, they were just teenagers. There are an awful lot of teenagers, particularly in the 70s and 80s, who are been placed in these institutions. Perhaps it's by the police, perhaps they'd run away from home, sort of, or very, very minor things that happened, but that this was seen as an alternative if you didn't know what else to do with them. So there are lots of women out there from a huge range of experiences who may have spent time in some of these institutions.
So there are differences between mother and baby homes and the laundries. Are there many instances of women who were in both?
Yes, and this is one of the sort of pathways in which women will often end up in one of the Good Sheppard homes, or again in Thorndale, both of which had on their grounds a mother and baby home. For some women, they may have ended up, particularly as if they're often very young, unmarried mothers, if their families have said that they are not happy for them to come back home, if they've got no family support and nowhere else to go, often they would end up being sort of moved over and end up in one of the either the industrial home or the laundry as well. So that was quite a common move across. Again, with the mother and same as with the mother and baby homes, there are a variety of experiences. There isn't one experience, and women ended up doing different things. But for some women, with a lack of support networks, were with nowhere else to go, and often again, if there were women who perhaps had learning difficulties or particular special needs, and who it was felt couldn't live independently, they may have ended up moving into the laundry.
It is quite recent, and the people who are in society, if any of them are watching, would it probably be a good idea just to break down what it is you're doing and how you do it? If I can go to you first, Sean.
If anybody wants to speak to us, I think you're going to put our telephone number up on the screen and our email address. So that's how they contact us. They'll speak then to Olivia D, who's the primary or researcher on the project. And they don't have to make any commitment at that stage. They can talk about how an interview might work, what the interview might contain. There might be only certain aspects of their story that they want to give to us, essentially. And they'll discuss then. They'll learn from Livy how the interview will work. Do they feel comfortable with it? If yes, they do, then they'll arrange an interview. And they can do that in their home, or they can come to Queen's University and do the interview there. And at that stage, then after the interview, we will transcribe the interview, and they'll receive a copy of the transcript. And at that stage, again, they can decide, I don't want this material to go forward, I want to delete this material. Or they may at that stage even say, I've changed my mind, I don't want to be part of the project. So at every stage really in the process, they're in control. They can withdraw from that process and withdraw their cooperation if they don't want to cooperate with us. Hopefully they will stay in the project, and we will then use their interview for the report that we write for the Department of Health. What we also want to do is to create a website where we have the transcripts from the interviews. For those people who agree to this website will have a kind of I suppose an introductory essay which explains the project and explains what we were doing, and the interviews and the background to them, and then we'll include those transcripts for people to read. So there's an option to engage in that, and again, certain individuals have opted to engage in that. Other individuals have said to us, no, I only want my interview to be used for the report for the Department of Health. So there's a website at the University of UCD, University College Dublin. If anybody wants to see the kind of thing we're talking about here, they can have a look at that. They'll see the kind of website that we hope to achieve with these interviews as well. So that's the kind of combined package. One is a report for the Department of Health. That's what they asked us to do. But we thought, you know, a lot of interviewees will have seen the delays over, you know, the historical institutional abuse inquiry, the delays since that has reported. So we wanted to offer them something else, and we think the website it offers us something else. It offers a format in which their stories can be seen and read by other individuals. And again, all of those stories are anonymised. Nobody's name is revealed. We're very, very careful to take out any kind of references to individuals or where they lived that can identify them. So again, hopefully the website will be something that people feel, you know, at least I've contributed, at least I've got my story out there, at least I feel that there's a debate that can come from this material appearing on the website. In
terms of people who are going to prepared to come forth and tell their story, what type of support is there for them? Because it will be, and you've mentioned yourself, it is, you know, there is a traumatic sort of element to it. So what other support is there for the people who contribute?
Post-interview, we remain in contact with the individuals to check that they're okay. So immediately after the interview, they will hear from us to check that they're okay. We also provide them with a list of support groups and telephone numbers and the websites of various support groups, including the victims and survivors groups that have been formed to kind of, if you like, self-supporting groups that have been formed over the last few years, but also the more conventional counselling services that also exist to support individuals who've been through this type of experience and have been through this kind of trauma in particular.
You have about 50 interviews, and the majority of those are from mother and baby homes. Is that the case?
A large portion of them, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So your appeal is to people who are in, you know, like the Good Sheppard Laundry, like that. Are you still interested in hearing from people who were in the mother and baby homes at this stage?
We are. We're always interested in hearing from individuals. I suppose the issue is we're coming towards a closure now in terms of our time frame. We have to report by the end of June, so anybody who we interview is going to have to come forward quite quickly now in order for us to have the time to interview them and also to transcribe the interview and to get their agreement that they're happy with the transcript, and we can then use it in the final report. So we're kind of a little bit constrained for time now. So we are, at this moment, I would say, prioritising individuals who come forward with stories about the laundry work and knowledge of those kind of testimonies and experiences. But obviously, anybody who comes forward, we will absolutely endeavour to interview them. I mean, you know, Livy is off to England shortly to interview somebody with testimony about one of the mother and baby homes, for example.
I'd like to thank Sean and Leanne for coming on, and best of luck with this project. It's very important.
Thank you very much. Thank you.